Hello everyone and welcome back to another video where I discuss different instruments that I own or play or am fascinated by. It's been a few months since I did one of these. The last one was on the mandolin. And today we're going to be talking about a magnificently beautiful instrument which is referred to in many different names, which we will get to, but which is generally referred to as the saz or Baglama. So the saz or Baglama is a long-necked, as you can see, a long-necked lute instrument which is prominent primarily in Anatolia, but it's also a little more complicated than that. So it's played in Turkey, in the Kurdish regions, among the Kurdish peoples. It's also played in certain places of Iran and Azerbaijan, and even some places in Eastern Europe. Now, the history of the saz is quite interesting, and it's also quite complicated because it comes from a long family of long-necked lutes, right? In particular, it is believed that the saz originated in an instrument called the Tanbur. Now, of course, you can go back as far back as you know, in the recorded history and find ancestors to this instrument. You find rock carvings in places like ancient Mesopotamia that have lutes in them, and so all, as far as we know, basically all lutes are derived and are descendants of those very ancient musical instruments. But when we talk about the saz, we usually say that it's descended from an instrument called the Tanbur, which appears basically in Sassanid Iran, right? Which is the 4th, 5th kind of century AD in Iran in the Sasanian Empire. That instrument, the Tanbur, which in itself is kind of a umbrella term, really. It should not necessarily be confused with the modern Kurdish tambur that's used in the Ali Haq ceremonies, for example. That is also a descendant of the ancient tambur, but it's not necessarily the same instrument. And the tambur is mentioned in many ancient and medieval texts. It often stood alongside the oud as one of the two sort of primary string instruments in this region in the Middle East in medieval times, even after the Islamic and Arab conquests and in the different Islamic caliphates. The tambur was a pretty popular instrument, especially in the eastern parts, you know, in Iran, and it eventually spread into Anatolia, modern Turkey and Kurdistan and so on. So the tambur becomes the saz. We first hear about the saz as an instrument basically in the 14th century in Anatolia. There are references to the saz in different poems. There's a Sufi poem, for example, that goes like this. Now I am a Sufi in the dervish convent, or a rascal in the tavern, or I twirl in the dance, or become a saz and am strummed. And so we can be pretty sure that at least an early version of the saz or Baglama appears in Anatolia as a result of the spread of the tambur from eastern lands sometime in the Middle Ages, right? Probably in the 14th, 15th century. And then it develops over time into the instrument that we see here today. It was used in various circumstances. It became a very renowned and popular instrument, and it's been used in a wide array of different contexts across history. The Ottoman Empire was, of course, the main political entity that ruled Anatolia and large portions of the Middle East for the early modern period, from the 15th to the to the 20th century, really. And so it is during Ottoman times that the saz really develops. And it's used in so many different circumstances. So the word saz, and this is where it gets complicated and confusing, this instrument is referred to by many different names, primarily two names, saz and baglama. Now, saz is, I would say, the most common term. It's the most sort of overarching sort of umbrella term for these instruments, and that is essentially a Persian word that means something like a musical instrument. Literally, I think it means something like to create or to compose, and essentially it means an instrument. That's one common word. Another way to refer to this instrument is baglama. And baglama probably comes from a Turkish word meaning to bind, which might be referring to the frets which you bind to the neck. And these two words are used essentially interchangeably in Anatolia today. So you can say saz, you can say baglama, and everyone knows that you're referring to this instrument. But it's also more complicated than that, because the word baglama is also used to refer to a specific body shape of the saz, so a kind of middle way size of the saz. Baglama can also be used to refer to a certain tuning that you tune this instrument in, which is not necessarily connected to the baglama size of the instrument. So it's really, it's confusing, right? Sometimes they use baglama as a specific version. Sometimes baglama is used for all of them. Sometimes we say saz. But all of this is essentially referring to this instrument, and we will get into those different versions of it later as well. But to make things easier, saz and baglama are terms that are used basically, for the most part, interchangeably to refer to this instrument. But that's the thing about this instrument. It exists in many different forms. It exists in many different sizes, different tunings, different ways of tying the frets. It's a very diverse instrument, right? So when we say saz or baglama, it refers to the long neck lute of Anatolia, but of course that lute can look in many different ways, and it certainly has across history. So this, which I'm holding here, is a somewhat standard size, but it is a long-necked saz. So the saz is already a long-necked lute, right? But this is a long-necked saz, so it's extra long. I have another instrument, which is a shorter-necked one. This one, which is a really beautiful instrument. It's not actually mine. I was very generously allowed to borrow this by a friend of mine who plays it. So this is a sort of short-necked baglama. It's basically the same size. It's smaller, obviously, but it's not significantly smaller. For the most part, it has a smaller neck, which allows for faster playing, for more sort of virtuoso playing, which is very popular today, for example. So that's important to remember, right? That when we talk about the saz, it's a very diverse instrument. Even though in the 20th century there has been a lot of standardization of the construction of the saz and the tuning of the saz and so on. Historically and still today in many places, it's a very diverse instrument, and it can look and sound in different ways. And this is because it was used in different circumstances. The saz, or before it used to also be referred to as the Tanbur, because it came from that instrument, it was used in many, many different circumstances. It became a very popular instrument for use by the Ottoman sultans. So the saz would be played in large orchestras in the courts of the Ottoman rulers. So in very sort of classical, higher brow maqam music. It was also used sometimes in the Mevlevi Sufi order in their music, but it's also been used in the countryside of Anatolia by different groups of people for different circumstances. In particular, there is a tradition in Anatolia of poet-singers, so traveling poet-musicians, which are known as ashiqs. This is a word that comes from the Arabic ashiq, which means lover, and is connected to Sufism, essentially. So this would be poet-singers, often connected to a Sufi order, which was very prominent and popular, still is, in Anatolia. And they would wander around and sing these songs of praise to the Prophet Muhammad, to different saints, but also more secular poetry, of course. This is a tradition that is still very much alive today, even though the repertoire, the poems, are more so secular today than they were in history. But you know, the ashiks is still a very prominent aspect of Anatolian culture. They would be traveling around the countryside. They would sing their songs. From the 16th century, they would appear at coffee houses. As coffee became a thing in the Ottoman Empire and people started drinking coffee, there would be ashiks sitting there as entertainment, singing stories with their saz, because the ashik was very strongly associated with this instrument in particular. It was the saz that was used by these traveling ashiks when they would go around and play and sing their songs and their poems. So it has a very strong connection to that culture, and even more so connected to Sufism and religious circumstances. The saz has been very prominent in the religious rituals of the Alevis, which is a ethno-religious group of people in Anatolia, as well as the Bektashi Sufi order. Now, these two groups are pretty similar, but also distinct in some significant ways. But both of them have used the saz and revere the saz as a very important aspect of their religious rituals. They will, for example, gather for something known as al-naġamāt, which is the ceremony where they will gather and listen to music, which is known in Sufism as sema. And in these sema sessions, the saz plays a very central role, right? So for the Alevis and the Bektashi Sufis, the Baglama or saz is a very revered, very special instrument. So you can see that it's been used in the whole spectrum of music in Anatolia, from the high courts of the Ottoman sultans to the singing, traveling poet musicians, the ashiks, and even to very formal religious ceremonies of different Sufi groups and for the Alevis. So it's a versatile instrument, an instrument that's very popular among a wide group of people in this region. And this is also why I'm telling you all this about the different context of the saz, because depending on the context, the saz would look different. So the saz of the Ottoman courts was constructed differently than the saz of the people of the countryside who were playing their particular local folk music. Usually there were more frets developed in the saz of the cities, of the courts, because that would be used to play classical maqam music, which was more or is more complex in its composition, required more complex scales and so on, whereas folk music, you know, to generalize, would use less complex scales in their compositions, right? So the saz would change based on that. And so you have all these different kinds of saz and different sizes and styles of the saz, which existed historically. Now in the 20th century, there was a kind of standardization with the appearance of the Turkish state, the Republic of Turkey in the 1920s. There was an attempt or there was a real emphasis on trying to highlight what they saw as Turkish culture, and the saz would play a very important role there as sort of the quintessential Turkish instrument, at least one of the quintessential Turkish instruments. And as a result of that and other developments in the 20th century, there started a kind of process of standardization. There developed a kind of standard way of constructing the saz, a standard way or ways of tuning it, a standard way of doing the frets and so on. Whereas historically, the saz was a very diverse thing, a very diverse instrument that could look in many different ways, which is still true to a large degree, but perhaps less so because of this standardization. For example, the shape of the saz as we see it today came about in the 20th century, adding the hole. So the saz has a hole here at the bottom. That wasn't there historically. That appeared in the 20th century. Things like adding octave strings, right? So you have this one, but you have the octave like that. That was also basically a 20th century invention. And then also the fretting. And we'll get to all of this soon. But basically in the 20th century, the saz as we know it becomes standardized, even though there exist many other forms of the saz and baglama across Anatolia even today. So in this new standardized form, the saz exists in a few different sizes and shapes. So this, what I'm playing today, is basically the most common shape, I would say, which is, I think, the Baglama shape, what is referred to as the Baglama shape, which exists in both the short-necked and the long-necked version. I'm not entirely sure, though, because, again, this stuff with all the names and everything can be quite confusing, and you can get different reports depending on who you ask. But so in general, there are a few different sizes. There's a really small version of the saz, which is known as the Jura saz. And there's a slightly bigger one, which is this one called Baglama, which is in both long-necked and short-necked form. Then you have something known as the Divan saz, which is a really big, sort of bassy saz. Sometimes there's a third version in between there called the Tanbur. Again, these names really confusing. And then the highest or the biggest saz is the Meydan saz, which is a really big, really bassy. And it also, of course, the shape of the saz affects the sound. So the smaller saz will have a much lighter sound in terms of the tone, and the big ones will be dark and bassy, naturally, right? So you have, for example, here is this Baglama saz. Even a short-necked one will differ from a long-necked one. So this is what this one sounds like. But if I change that to the long-necked one, immediately you're going to hear a difference. This is partly, of course, because it's tuned differently, but that's the whole thing, right? It's tuned differently because the body size demands a lower tuning. So this sounds like this. So different sizes, different shapes, different styles. There are many different kinds of saz. Now, I guess this would be a good time to get into the actual instrument rather than its history and the different context in which it was played. The saz, again, long-necked lute. It's made of wood, different kinds of wood usually. It has sort of a pear-shaped sort of bowl body. Pretty sharp bowl compared to something like an oud, for example. Now, historically, it would have more of a sort of cone shape, and in many regions of Anatolia, it still does, especially in the countryside and so on. But this would be sort of a very common, modern, standardized saz shape. The woods used for this instrument, there's, well, different woods depending on which part of the body. So the actual body of the saz is very commonly made of mulberry wood, but also other similar kinds of wood to that. You sometimes see juniper wood, for example. And then the soundboard is usually spruce, sometimes pine, but mostly spruce. And then the rest, basically the neck and the pegs and the fretboard and so on, are different kinds of hardwood. So you can have oak, you can have mahogany is very popular when it comes to the saz. So there are different options, but those are some of the most common ones. It's a really cool shape, I think. The strings are, it's sort of like a floating bridge here. I'm gonna see if I can show you in the other camera here. Sort of floating bridge kind of construction. And then there is usually a hole, especially on modern Baglamas. You have the hole at the bottom here is probably the most common. On my long-necked saz, the hole is not at the bottom, but instead over here, right at the top of the body here, with a little sort of rosette ornament, which looks really nice, right? So again, different options there, but those are the woods. The strings of the saz are steel strings, essentially. which you can probably tell from the sound. As with most string instruments, traditionally or historically, originally, gut strings would be used, but the steel strings became common fairly early, actually. I think like 16th, 17th centuries when they started using steel strings. But so, steel strings have been strongly associated with the saz for a very long time. And it really does add to that very characteristic sound, right? In terms of the strings, it is usually, right, so again, there is diversity here in history and today, but in the standardized form of the saz, there are usually 3 courses of strings on the saz. And the most common way to do it is that you have first a double course, which contains an octave, right, like that, which gives you a really fat, cool sound. And the second chorus will be another double chorus, but not with an octave, but with 2 strings tuned to the exact same note, right? The same octave. And then the bottom strings, or the top strings, are usually a 3 chorus with 1 lower octave and 2 higher octaves. Now on this one I only have 2, but the same idea is there, right? You have a lower octave and a higher one. And that sort of octave tuning, just like on a 12-string guitar, for example, really gives it a really, really cool sound. In terms of the tuning, as you probably already noticed, the standard, the most common way to tune the saz is to tune it in fifths. And on this long-necked version, that is usually a G, then a D, and an A. But as usual, there are differences in tuning depending on the region. In some places they tune it in one way, in others they tune it in another way. Depending on the size of the saz, they will be tuned differently. Sometimes people will tune their saz depending on the song that they're gonna play. So, based on the maqam or the scale, they will tune it based on that. So there's diversity here. But just to show you, my other saz, which is not actually mine, again, my friend's beautiful short-necked saz, is rather tuned in C, which much higher, as you can tell, but also it is tuned in, the first 2 are in fifths, so that's a C, and then that would be a G, but then the third one, I've done sort of I just tuned it in a special way for myself, which is that I have another C there. It's just the way that I've been playing it for the last few weeks. It allows me to do some cool stuff. I really love this one. I'm very thankful that I was allowed to borrow it. I really love this saz. Really beautiful. You can see the wood here. It's just really pretty. I'm not sure what wood this is. I'm not a wood expert, but just really beautiful. And as you've probably noticed also, the saz, especially if you're used to guitars and things like that, this neck looks pretty crazy, right? There are a lot of frets. Now remember, the word Baglama, which is one of the two main names for this instrument, might come from a Turkish word meaning to bind. And that is because all these frets are, well, you bind them around the neck and they are movable frets. So if I wanted to, I could move this one up, however far I want. And this is because, Middle Eastern music, not just Middle Eastern music, but, music from many different cultures, but in Anatolia, in Persia, and in the Arab countries, there are a lot of different scales, which are known as maqamāt. A scale is known as a maqam. It's more than a scale, it's a mode, essentially. And they often contain quarter tones, which are tones or notes in between the half steps of the 12 classic Western scale. So very familiar to Western ears would be, these notes. But you also have this. But I made just regular minor scale, right? But then you have this one. That's a quarter tone. That's in between these half steps. So if I just go chromatically up here, it would sound like this. Right? It's a lot more notes than the regular 12-note Western scale. And so the reason that there are so many frets is because there are more notes that you can play in maqam music. And we saw that this structure, having these many frets and all these different notes, comes primarily from the Ottoman musical repertoire, which played maqam music, whereas in the folk music of the countryside, they would not have as many frets. They would they had a few scales that they used, and then they would have those few frets that they needed for that. But when you want to play a large repertoire of music with different maqams and modes and so on, you need to be able to play these quarter notes, which is why there are these many frets. But yeah, those are the frets, which again creates a lot of that sound that is so unique to an instrument like the saz. You're able to do stuff like. Right, those kinds of, that's not possible if you don't have that quarter tone to hammer off or do those things with, right? So that's a very important part of the modern saz, or the saz sound, those quarter notes. And that is what allows you to play such beautiful pieces as this old classic, which is based on a poem by the Sufi poet Yunus Emre from Anatolia, a really beautiful and renowned poet who expressed his mysticism of love through poetry. And there's a song that is usually accompanied by his lyrics that sounds like this. So that's essentially the saz. It's an absolutely beautiful instrument, both in its short-necked form and its long-necked form and its small form and all the different varieties in which this instrument exists, because, as I said, it really is a diverse instrument. And unlike an instrument like the oud, which of course is still developing and being worked on, many of those traditional instruments have this kind of aura around them where people don't like to change too much, right? They want to keep it in its classical form. The saz isn't like that necessarily. The saz is constantly being renewed today. It's a very living instrument in that way. There are electric saz instruments which are very popular, and there are new innovations and aspects added to the saz all the time, right? So it's a living instrument in that way that's being worked on, that's evolving, that is changing, which is, of course, which has been true always in history with this instrument, but is still true very much today. It's used all over the place. It's probably the most common and most widespread instrument, I would say, in Turkey and in Anatolia in general today. Now, even though you, of course, listened to me play in the course of this video and thought, wow, this guy is really amazing, just kidding. Obviously, I'm not a professional saz player. I have a saz. I use it for composition. It's a wonderful instrument for arranging music in different ways. It provides a lot of flavor and color to compositions. And so I love to use this instrument, but I am in no way a professional saz player. Even less so than I am, an oud player. I'm pretty decent at playing the oud, at least. The saz I have much less experience with, even though I love the instrument so much. But so what I thought I'd do is that I would end this video by giving you a glimpse into someone who can actually play it properly, namely my friend Dilovan, who also lent me this saz in particular. So I'm going to end this video by having him play a little bit for you. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope this was an interesting video and that you're looking forward to more videos about different rare and common instruments that are just so fascinating to explore and play, essentially. So thank you all so much, and I will see you in a future video.